Welcome back to Diasporas. I am your host, Victor Mudama. We are back for another episode of Ask the Professor. We got a treat for you, back to back this time. Today, we are going to continue with our Global Powers in Africa series. Thank you to everybody who has been supporting us thus far. Please like, comment, share, subscribe. And we already did China, just to recap. We did Russia. Please refer back to those talks. Super informative, super great. Today, we're going to dive into the United States, and we're going to wrap up the Global Powers in Africa series with European colonial powers. Without further ado, let's hop right into it. Our favorite professor is back, Dr. Joshua M. Kivuva. Thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. If this is your first time, please, if you can get time to look at our previous series on China and the other one on Russia, it will be good. But we'll make this independent of those so that if it is the first time, you can still follow. So today we're going to continue with our Global Powers in Africa series. And we've already seen the influence of China in Africa, why China the last 2 decades has done a lot to get involved in Africa. We saw the other day about the Russian interests in Africa. So today, and probably the next couple of episodes, we're going to look at US-Africa relations. But today we're going just to look at them specifically from the US perspective. Why has US been interested and involved in African politics? And just to compare it a little bit with the Chinese and with Russia, we saw that for China and for Russia, both were driven by domestic purposes, domestic factors that drove them to their interactions in Africa. Even though the rate of influence between China and Russia have been very different, but they were all driven by domestic factors. The US is completely different from that. The US, since its involvement in Africa even before independence, although today we're going to look at it post-1960, when African countries gained their independence, the US involvement, engagement, and interest and its policies in Africa were not so much driven by domestic factors in America. Rather, they were driven, and they have been driven by global interests. They have been driven by external factors related towards the propagation of American power, American hegemony, American superiority, and its quest to acquire the superpower status, to maintain the superpower status, but to protect it as well, especially at the beginning of these interactions in the 60s, where America was challenged by the former Soviet Union. And therefore, throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, in fact, almost up to the end of the 1990s with the end of the Cold War after the collapse of the Soviet Union, ideological, political, and security interests and goals were dominant when it came to America's American relationship or the US relationship and foreign policy in Africa. Throughout the Cold War period and into the end of the 20th century, non-domestic, non-economic factors were the overriding goals for the United States policy in Africa. In fact, even when domestic factors became key, they have neither been the only nor have they been the most overriding in determining US policy, US actions, or US strategy in Africa. In fact, it is only in the 21st century, post the 2000s, that economic and humanitarian goals either rose to comparable position as the strategic, political, and security goals. Whether we are talking about the economic, security, ideological, or even political goals in Africa, America has consistently pursued them through diplomacy, development aid, military cooperation, sometimes military threats, and economic partnerships. The second thing that we need to understand as we begin the few lessons on US Africa interests is that the objects for US interests in Africa, its goals, and its strategy in Africa have changed over time depending on changes in the global system. It has, if we look at American interests in Africa in the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, they were very different from those in the 80s when the Cold War was coming to an end. It is different from the 1990s. It is different from the post 2000. So to be able to understand US engagement, US interest in Africa, we divided its involvement into 6 different and separate epochs or periods. The first one going to the 1960s and 1970s, when majority of African countries were gaining their independence. Then the 1980s, which was the height of the Cold War. Then the 1990s, the post-Cold War period. The 2000s, and the 2000s coincided with a new threat after the Cold War. Terrorism became a major concern for America's foreign policy. And then the 2010s, there was a little bit of realignment. And then from 2010s to 2020s, we saw a repeat of the Cold War. But this time, the threat not being communism, the threat not being the Soviet Union, the threat now coming from China, and the threat and the competition changing from being an ideological one, which was the main characteristic of the Cold War period, to one that is economic competition. And now in the post-2020s, we see this becoming not just a purely economic competition, but becoming a techno war, becoming now a war of artificial intelligence, or African intelligence, as many people look at it. So now what I want to do is to look at each one of these periods and show exactly what the concern was and what America tried to gain, what America tried to do. So we look at the first one, the 1960s and the 1970s. This, we have titled it as the period of decolonization in Africa. America is not considered a major colonial power. It was not a colonial power, never colonized the African continent, but was very interested in what the African countries became after colonialism. There was the fear that because most of the colonial powers were from Western Europe, aligned with America during the war, there was the fear that because they were fighting European interests, Western European interests, mainly identified with America, there was likely to be a push towards communism. Many of the African countries, when they were fighting for independence, the ideology of African socialism was found in almost every political movement, every anti-colonial movement, and the Americans mistook African socialism for socialism that existed in Europe and China, and also mistook it for communism. And this was the time of McCarthy, where just being a communist was identified with the devil himself. So that fear of Africa gaining independence, but rather than turning west to turning east to becoming communistic and socialist, was very high. If you remember Mwalimu Nyerere's African socialism in Tanzania and the establishment of Ujamaa villages. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, the major American or US interests and goals in Africa aimed at ensuring that these independent African countries did not turn east, did not become communists. So the American government, even clandestine, though still identified with Western European powers, was giving these independent African countries support, but was trying to make them pro-Western democracies. Much of what was being done this time was being done clandestinely. A very good book that was done that time, showing you exactly how America did it, is the CIA Dirty Work in Africa, explaining how the coups were being staged and planned. But the fear really was to ensure that African countries didn't turn communist or socialist. America ended up supporting some of the worst leaderships that have ever existed in Africa, creating the famous Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire. Turned out to be one of the worst that existed. America was ambivalent in the fight against apartheid, the apartheid regime in South Africa during that period. So by the end of the 1970s, almost every African country had become independent except for South Africa. So the fear of African countries becoming socialistic or turning into communism had ended. So by the 1980s, there was a little bit of a shift. And the shift there moved from just that fear to helping the African countries sustain their independence, but also change the governments. And this America again did it through clandestine means. They used proxy military groups existing within the countries just to ensure that the African countries, number one, were not stable, but number two, they did not, the governments did not fall to communist leaning countries. So the US, although this was still during the height of the Cold War conflicts, the US became more involved in the affairs of the African countries through the supply of weapons. They became more militarily involved. They supported every anti-communist group wherever it existed. And one of the places where it did the most was in Angola, by supporting the UNITA rebels in Angola that were opposed to the pro-Soviet Union government. It was also the first time that America got involved in the Horn of Africa. And those who know the map of Africa, the Horn of Africa turned to be probably the bedrock of conflicts, especially Islamic leaning conflicts. We are talking of Somalia. We are talking of Ethiopia. We are talking of the Ogaden region, where since the 1970s to the end of the 1980s, elements between the Somalis and the Ethiopians, and to an extent Kenyans, have been fighting. And because the purpose of the US government was to ensure that this region was unstable, to ensure that it doesn't go communist. At one point, they would be supporting the Somali guerrillas. When they proved to be stronger, it supported Ethiopians. Occasionally, it would support Kenya. So the American involvement in the Horn of Africa kept shifting from one to the other. By the 1980s, American voices, especially in Congress, had also started growing in support of freedom fighters in Africa, in South Africa. And the US Congress started passing sanctions against the apartheid regime, but it never supported it very much until the 1990s. So the 1990s, by the end of the 1980s, the Cold War was coming to an end. The fall of the wall of Berlin and the official end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany. Now in the 1990s, America's policy in Africa changes. And the change here can be characterized by a shift and a retreat from the policies that it had been pursuing since the 1960s, that was driven by the fear of African countries becoming communistic or becoming socialist, to now rethinking. So the 1990s, the post-Cold War period, can be classified as a period where America tried to retreat from Africa. America tried to re-engage. And in this re-engagement, we saw a major shift taking place from a purely ideological security and global strategic needs to democratization. And in Africa, this coincides with the period that is called the period of second democratization wave in Africa, where America's aid, America's economic support to African countries was tied to progress towards democratization. So their rethinking of American goals, American strategy here now reorients towards humanitarian aid, towards democratization, towards a re-engagement in it. So the nature of relations can be classified as democratization, humanitarian aid, and limited engagement as America reevaluates what it wants to pursue there. So humanitarian engagements now became key. But before everything clears here, a major thing happens in Africa. The Rwandan genocide takes place, and America, because of its involvement in Africa, is blamed for it, that it didn't do much to prevent it. And because of that, American humanitarian aid is geared towards there. The same period, we see also the collapse of the Somali government and US involvement again in Somalia. But we know what happened when the 4 soldiers were killed and dragged in the streets of Mogadishu. If you have watched the movie Black Hawk Down, it gives a very good picture of what happened. But now, the problem with that is that public opinion in America was greatly affected by that those images of the four soldiers being dragged. And Americans started asking themselves, why are we getting involved in this place? And you see the disengagement, the retreat taking place in the 90s was as a result of that. But we have also said it was also a period of re-engagement, and this is why now America recreated itself and strengthened the humanitarian aid. USAID created this time now to be another arm of the American government, but one that is geared towards doing humanitarian work. Focus again on good government, focus on free markets, focus on issues that are not necessarily ideological, they are not security. This is also the time that AGOA was created, the groundwork for AGOA, which will be the basis of future American engagement there. So now, coming to the 2000s, again, new changes become. And this is what we'll say brought about the second shift. And this second shift was a little bit also determined by factors that take place in the US. 9/11 takes place here, and terrorism now becomes the major global threat, almost comparable to the Cold War and the ideological difference that was. Those of us who are students of American politics, we say that America cannot survive without a foreign enemy. And while during the Cold War, the foreign enemy was the Soviet Union, was the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, America had tried to create a foreign enemy, and they had not managed until 9/11, when another event that affected the common American happened, 9/11. And as a result of that, American policymakers now made terrorism and anti-terrorism measures as important basis of American foreign policy. Fortunately or unfortunately, these were identified with groups that were operating outside America, many of them operating in the Horn of Africa, operating in North Africa. So again, after 2000, Africa became another center of American policy, but now this time towards countering terrorism. And these were terrorism like the Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda, many of them operating within the Horn of Africa. Again, the 2000s coincided with the time that democratization and development and security partnerships were key for Americans. It is this time that we also, because of the threat of AIDS epidemic, that we saw also America engaging through what we call health diplomacy, that they tried to support African governments to ensure that they have strong health projects. The HIV AIDS epidemic, giving them a basis. So by by the 2010s, American humanitarian, American health support, American development partnership had become key. But because of the threats of terrorism, we see them also creating the so-called AFRICOM, the African Command, which was the consolidation of US military bases in several African countries, meant to combat terrorism. But we also see new partnerships emerging in non-security matters, in health, in economics, and in trade. Coming now to the 2010s, this is famous because this is now the Obama period. Obama, being a native of Africa, the expectation when he was made president was expected to make a very significant change in the relationships. And although he tried, but the 2010s coincided also with something else that was more momentous, and that was the rise of China as a competing power globally for America. And therefore, however much the expectation was that Obama would change the relations that Africa had with the US, the fight to tame, to contain China became a more overriding factor, meaning that Obama would not have done whatever he wanted to do. So this period, it was characterized by competition with China. So economic diplomacy and America's soft power were tailored not so much at benefiting African countries as they had expected, now that one of their own was ruler of America, but one that those relations were to take a secondary position towards the containment of China. That notwithstanding, we saw a few changes, well, significant changes. The first major change was the US changing from aid, humanitarian aid or foreign aid, to trade. America hosted the first US African Leaders Forum and Summit in 2014 and launched an initiative to provide power to improve electricity access in most African countries. It also shifted away from paternalistic aid to what they call the partnership-based approach, where American and African leaders, or America and the continent, will relate with one another as partners, not as a big brother and a weaker brother. But then, because the threat of Al-Shabaab was still there, you find the 2010s were also characterized by continued military focus, especially in the Horn of Africa and in the Sahels. That now takes us to the present, the 2020s. And here again, geographic, geopolitical, and great power competition has taken center stage. That the Cold War has already been recreated, but this time, rather than the ideological and military competition, rather than the nuclear race, rather than the Star Wars, rather than all the large militaries, today we are seeing this is an economic war between China and America. It is also a technological war. It is also war on artificial intelligence. And this is proving to be more existential than the Cold War was. So America, in the 2020s, we see issues of democratization taking a backstage. America competing with China, that is not putting conditions for African countries to get aid, is trying to reduce its insistence on good governance, which was the overriding theme since the 1990s. We see China and Russia joining hands and seeming to compete with the US. We see there is a lot of digital influence, issues of climate change. So the Biden administration has tried to propagate democracy, anti-corruption, and good governance, but all those have taken a backstage to efforts towards countering China influence in Africa. They have the Biden administration. Remember, Biden was the deputy to Obama. So he still continued with the policy of seeing African countries and the African Union as a strategic partner to the US. But then the debt trap and authoritarian regimes that have tended towards China have posed a threat that is forcing America to rethink what it is doing in Africa. Issues of climate change again becoming dominant, and the climate change is being dealt with at a global level. They have not tried to make anything specific. But then, more important, after Obama, there was the first Trump administration, which was a practice to what he is doing in the second administration. The Project 2025 seems to be, among other things, a project against everything that is black. And therefore, Africa in the second Trump administration has taken a completely backstage, and it's almost being forgotten. The humanitarian aid through US aid that had controlled the most communicable diseases in Africa, that had contained aid, they have all been withdrawn with the elimination of the Department of USAID, and their offices in Africa closed. The insistence on good governance is no longer being given prominence in the second Trump administration. And as a result of that, even the little benefits that Africa seems to get from the US doesn't seem to be there, because America now is pursuing an American first policy. And that American first policy is not good for Africa. So unless a miracle happens and changes happen, Africa is likely to fare badly in the second Trump administration, unless the African population rise to demand for changes. But those demands will come without the support that dissident groups and opposition movements have traditionally gained from America. But we'll see more of this and discuss each one of them in the next 2 or 3 lessons that we're going to have. Thank you very much.
Professor, that was phenomenal. This is clearly a very dense unit. And one of the things I noticed is China was also very dense. You mentioned in yesterday's lecture that China and the United States are number 1 and number 2. As far as America's reach, are they using each other as points of leverage? And could Africa and African countries that are involved with the both of them, could they potentially use the offers they get from each respective country to sweeten the deal from the other one, essentially using them as leverage points for negotiations?
Potentially, yes, but with the kind of political elites that we have in Africa, completely incapable of doing that. Because think of all these people. When America was the dominant one, the Mobutu Sese Sekos, they looted from their community. The Bokazas, they looted from their community. Where did they invest that money? In London, in DC, in New York. After they died, where is that money? Where is Sani Abacha's money that we know was put in New York, was put in London Stock Exchange? So these people are the beneficiaries of the looting that African leaders have been doing. In fact, I think if you were to trace even that so-called humanitarian aid, as long as it came in terms of finances, probably a quarter of the money never even left DC, never left London. They were retained there because even America, even UK, even China has to bribe the African political elite to do anything in their countries.
Wow, that is very powerful. As we continue this global Powers in Africa series, we're about to put a cap on the context around it. After this series, I would like to really dive into how each country is navigating these complex relationships. We can even go through the map and navigate, okay, what countries are in this country? And what global powers are operating in this country and what do they want? And kind of use the background knowledge that we have gained from this Global Powers in Africa series to understand the current frame of geopolitics. So thank you so much for this talk. Is there anything else you would like to cap to culminate this particular unit?
No, just stay tuned for the analysis of each one of them. It will be quite interesting.
Thank you so much. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share. This has been Ask the Professor. We thank you guys for your support. I want to give a special shout out to Boot Up for continuing to support us, not only with our space, but with equipment and editing. And please shout out to Boot Up. Everybody comment Boot Up if you made it this far in the video. I'm Victor Mudama, your host, and this has been another episode of Ask the Professor. And we are Diasporous Media. Thank you so much.